Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about an analogy that I think might be helpful in understanding respiratory virus deaths during the last 2 years. And let me start by saying something that folks in the lockdown cult will often say. They'll say, 1 million people have died, and so are you suggesting that we shouldn't have done all of the things that we did? So just let's think about that for a minute. Now, a lot of the excess deaths that have occurred, as I've hinted at here, and on Twitter and elsewhere, I've sort of ran through these many dozens and dozens of papers and that go through the excess deaths at all ages that have nothing to do with COVID. So when you have panic and when you have hysteria, there's tremendous numbers of excess deaths through that, either through lack of care or change in medical practice, which standard medical practice, people staying home because they're afraid or they're encouraged to not go to the hospital unless it's very dangerous, missed appointments, and then of course with massive economic damage comes along with it, subconsequent lowering standard care. And in much of the developing world, we have massive economic damage, and there will be lots of excess deaths, and has been by virtue of that. But I want to focus today not on excess deaths generally, but on just COVID deaths. And even with COVID deaths, I'm not going to be worried too much about the difference right now between by COVID and deaths with COVID. So now the difficulty with the argument, let me just go back to the claim that some people say, look, oh my gosh, in the United States, 1 million people have died over the last couple of years. And so are you suggesting that we shouldn't have done those interventions? Now, or if they say, well, how could those interventions have caused all of these COVID deaths? It's COVID that caused the deaths, right? And no one's saying that COVID is not, at least in many of these cases, it really was with COVID. And of course, many cases it was, and it was a death by a car accident, and maybe they had it, tested positive. Well, let's set all that aside. Now, I think there's a way to understand this that comes across very easy by virtue of this analogy with a captain of a ship. Now, in a captain of a ship who panics, and during there's some kind of breach in the hull, and there's several thousand people on board, and when that breach happens, you can imagine two different kinds of ships. One where the captain behaves responsibly, is careful during the process of the sinking, or at least the hobbling of the ship, which eventually maybe makes it back or is eventually rescued. But during that process, a few people are lost, and when you're lost, in that case, when you die, it's by drowning, because you're basically floating in water. So the deaths, so maybe that captain loses 10. But then there was the panicked one, and then on that ship, they didn't follow procedure. They failed to do what they were trained to do, and what all of the criteria said you should do, what the interventions you should or shouldn't do when there's a breach. And instead, on that ship, you had 1,000 people die. Now, they died of drowning, right? Now, you can imagine that on the ship that panicked and hysterically did all of the wrong things, where a much greater fraction of the boat passengers drowned, you could say, look, 1,000 people drowned. Are you saying that we shouldn't have done all of those interventions that we did? And of course, here it's obvious, like, no, it's because of your interventions, your panicked interventions, that you had so many people that died of drowning. Right? It's because of those interventions. Because of your panic, more people drowned. You stupid captain, right? That's what you would say to the person. Now, in the way that you should think about respiratory viruses in this analogy is that, look, we're floating every winter, seasonality, every winter, we're all floating, literally. It's just floating around us. We're floating in a bath of respiratory viruses. These are aerosols. They just float through the air. And they're going hither and thither, and they're traveling in the environments where people are potentially have symptoms. And so if you behave inappropriately, if you panic, if you're the captain of the ship when there's a pandemic, or when there's just a virus that's coming through, and you start doing things that are unusual and breaking protocol, well, you're going to end up with a lot of not just the excess deaths that I talked about throughout non-COVID related things, you're going to end up with many more drownings, so to speak. many more people are going to end up with COVID than otherwise would. Many people are going to be dying of or with COVID than otherwise would because you panicked. Because you did the things you shouldn't have done. You shouldn't have confined people in their homes where they in fact transmit it more quickly. You shouldn't have put everybody from hospitals that were infected and sent them back to LTC homes. You shouldn't have put people on respirators, which just make and thus need sedatives, which make them more likely to pass away. You shouldn't have made everybody frightened to go to the hospital, in which case many of these people died at home with much greater fraction, and many of them with COVID. Now, so you have, it boggles my mind, frankly, that what is so obvious on a ship, when you're a massive failure on a ship, and because of your panic, 1,000 people have died of drowning on your ship, you would laugh in their face if they said, "Oh my God, but if I hadn't done those, it could have been worse." Or, are you saying that those people didn't die of drowning? Are you accusing me of killing them? No, they died of drowning. Water was the enemy, and I was just trying to save them from water. No. Compared to the ship over there, you killed many more by virtue of your actions, which led to more drownings. Whereas Sweden, the ship over there, has only a few deaths because they didn't behave hysterically. And that was your science moment.